his colleagues very often, very angry at him for not supporting the war and pushing this, what they called enemy science at the time. So he not only had to deal with attacks from his colleagues about this, but he was also a conscientious objector to the war, meaning he refused to go fight, even if he was going to be drafted. And that meant that he could be arrested and sent to prison, too. So not only did he have sort of the professional stakes, but also deeply personal ones, right? It was entirely possible that he was going to lose his freedom by defending this sort of stuff.
Well, the triumph, so to speak, of Eddington and Einstein, which I think I have heard of, is the eclipse of 1919, which helps to establish relativity by viewing a solar eclipse. And this story helps explain why that was so important and so risky. So can you tell me about the eclipse of 1919 and the events leading up to that for Eddington to try to use this event to prove relativity?
So one of the predictions that Einstein makes in his theory of general relativity is that gravity can bend light. And you would see this happen only in really extraordinary circumstances. So you need something huge like the sun that has really powerful gravity. And then if you look at the image of a star right near the edge of the sun, the star's image would appear to be distorted in this very particular way that Einstein predicted. So you can go and look for that and then decide whether or not relativity is true based on that observation. The problem, of course, is that the sun is bright, so you can't usually see stars during daytime, so you have to wait for a total solar eclipse. And those are rare, right? They don't happen very often, and they happen in inconvenient parts of the world, too. So Einstein had been trying to get someone to do this test for years by this point, but he had no luck. And during the war, since Germany was blockaded, it was totally impossible. But Eddington takes the project on his own. That is, he decides that this is a thing he is going to do. So he has to marshal support. Fortunately, his friend is a guy named Frank Dyson, the astronomer royal, the most important astronomer in England, and that gets him the money he needs and kind of the material support. And the next eclipse that was coming up after these events was in May of 1919, as you say, and it would only be visible in the southern hemisphere. So Eddington has to get a team together, and they gather up their telescopes and their cameras, and they travel several thousand miles on shipping that is just recovering from the end of the war. They've been starving in England, and suddenly they find themselves on this little rock off the west coast of Africa where they're going to do the test, and they have to essentially set up an observatory in the middle of the jungle and wait for this 1 6-minute period during the eclipse and take photographs during that moment. The weather almost ruins the whole thing. They're almost stranded because of a shipping strike. But they eventually take these precious photographs back to England and spend months measuring and calculating based on those results. So it actually isn't until November, right, 6 months after the actual eclipse, that they're ready to announce that the results actually do support Einstein's prediction.
And what was the reception when this is finally published?
Well, this is an interesting thing. So Eddington worked hard before the expedition to kind of set things up so he would get the best reception possible. So he and his friend Dyson had been talking to reporters and newspapers and magazines to get everyone excited ahead of time about the results so that when they finally did come back, people would be sort of champing at the bit to hear what was ready to go. And I should say it worked. So the day after they announced the results, it's on the front page of the Times of London. The next day, it's on the New York Times. And the headlines are extraordinary. A revolution in science, Einstein versus Newton, lights askew in the heavens. And Eddington is sort of primed and ready to go. So he's got popular lectures. He's writing articles. He does everything he can to get everybody excited about this new theory. And because of this sort of careful preparation, Einstein goes from obscurity to most famous person in the world essentially overnight.
And at that point, is his, I suppose, Germanness forgiven by the Allied side from World War I?
It is, and in a weird sense, Eddington emphasizes it, right? Because Eddington wants this to be a great moment for scientific internationalism. So Eddington really hits the national issues to stress how extraordinary it is that English and German science come together in this way right after the end of the war. And this is, again, one of the reasons that Einstein becomes so famous so quickly, is that he becomes a symbol of this kind of rapprochement after the end of the war.
Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a very short break for a word from our sponsors.
And it's interesting, I never think about this in terms of Einstein's biography. I think about him in World War II and talking about the theoretical aspects of the atomic bomb, writing to Roosevelt, being in the United States. Do you have any sense of his World War I experiences shaping how much he supported the Allies during World War II?
So this is actually this is an interesting kind of turnaround for Einstein. So during World War I, Einstein's a dedicated pacifist. He thinks the war is a terrible thing, nationalism is a terrible thing, and he does everything he can to stop the war and prevent future wars from happening. And he sort of lays the blame for the war on nationalism and patriotism kind of as an idea. But then after the war, eventually he stays in Germany, and the Nazis come to power, and eventually Einstein is chased from his home, almost literally, and he ends up in the United States. And he's not alone in that. So there's actually this large group of refugee scientists that flee the Nazis and the other fascist powers in the 1930s, and a lot of them end up in the United States. And that group, having seen the Nazis up close, are terrified of what Hitler might be able to do. And Einstein is one of them, and he's worried that he knows that an atomic bomb is a possible thing, and he's desperately worried that the Nazis will get it first. So he puts aside all of his pacifism, all of his commitment to stopping war, to spur FDR to start building the atomic bomb, because the Nazis are, what Hitler could do with it is such a terrifying prospect. And it's sort of one of the great moral moments of Einstein's life, is he has to choose what's more important to him, pacifism or making sure the Nazis don't win the war. And he chooses the latter. But then after the war, he sort of realizes what he has unleashed and rededicates himself to pacifism again. He works for world government. He works for nuclear disarmament. It's really a fascinating kind of arc to his character.
And what happened to Eddington after 1919?
He becomes very well known in the English-speaking world, partially because of his connection to Einstein, but more, he becomes one of the great science popularizers of the day. So he writes a whole series of popular science books explaining relativity and quantum physics and the nature of the universe. He's also one of the first scientists to work closely with the BBC on their new radio science pieces, so he comes right into people's homes, as it were. So he ends up getting knighted, and he gets the Order of Merit, largely because he's able to explain the new science to the popular world. And in addition to just being good at explaining science, people call him one of the most reassuring thinkers, because he wants to tell people that just because they live in a world of relativity and quantum physics doesn't mean that they have to give up the way they've thought about free will and religious belief and kind of traditional structures of the world.
So he's sort of an early 20th century Stephen Hawking, Neil deGrasse Tyson type of person.
Exactly. Yep, that's right.
All right. Well, yeah, thank you for sharing all this with us. What would you think in this story is the message that you would like readers to take from your book?
Well, there's a bunch, but I think one of them is that science is messy and difficult. And I think that's important because we often want to tell stories about science in which everything is always clear and easy, right? Einstein just sat down, wrote the equations, people recognized they were right, and he was celebrated as a genius. But in fact, it takes 10 years of struggle in which he desperately needs his friends and his allies to even make sense of his own theory, and then another 4 years after that before he can convince people it is true. That it takes a lot of effort to make a scientific idea real, and we like to kind of delete that so the story seems easier and clearer. But in fact, it's okay that it takes work and controversy to convince people about scientific ideas.
Well, Matthew, your book is Einstein's War, How Relativity Triumphed Amid the Vicious Nationalism World War I, and you are also a podcast host, the What the If podcast. If
Yes.
people would like to find more about this show and you online, where is the best place to do so?
Yeah, so whattheif.com is a great place to get our show. And my co-host, Philip Shane, maintains an active Twitter at What the If Show. So you can check out not just our show itself, but lots of cool science news.
Great, and I'll include those links in the show notes for people to check that out. Matthew, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, that's all I have for today. There's probably a million other things that could be said, but I think this is a good stopping point. As always, I want to thank the Knowlton's Rangers, especially our spy masters, Bill Ivey, Joyce Normant, Tyler from Colorado, Josh Reddick, Baron Fraser, Chris from Maine, Carl from Norway, Moondoggy from Ohio, Rick Knowlton, Vic and Irene, Mike from New York, Michelle, and Marlene. I'll explain what that is in a second. If you like the show and want to help it grow, there are 4 easy ways for you to do it. 1, like and subscribe to the show on the podcast player of your choice. This helps spread the word about the show. 2, join our Facebook group. Here we can keep the discussion going about new episodes, and you can talk about what you like and didn't like. And you can find this group if you just search for History Unplugged on Facebook. 3, we have an online store with t-shirts, phone covers, and other accessories featuring awesomely bad history puns that were crowdsourced by you, the audience. And you can find that if you go to public.com and look for History Unplugged, or you just go to historyonthenet.com and look for our store there. 4, and this is really the best way to dive deep with History Unplugged, and that's to become one of the Knowlton's Rangers. If you know your American history, you know the Knowlton's Rangers were an elite spy and reconnaissance group in the American Revolutionary War, but it's also the name of the membership program of History Unplugged. You can join at 3 levels. If you join at the level of Scout, you can hear all the episodes of History Unplugged completely ad-free and get early access to new episodes, at least a week early. If you join at the Intelligence Officer level, you get special bonus episodes, like a 10-part series on the World War II hero Audie Murphy, a multi-part series called Ottoman Lives about different people in the Ottoman Empire, and a series called Rendezvous with Death that looks at biographical profiles of Americans who went to fight in World War I before America entered the war. The last level is Spy Master, where you get all that stuff, but you also get 3 hardcover history books, Forging a President, How the Wild West Created Teddy Roosevelt, Race to the Top of the World, Richard Byrd and the First Flight to the North Pole, and The Last Fighter Pilot, the true story of the final combat mission of World War II. Another bonus is, you can choose a history topic for me to focus on for an entire episode that can go up to an hour, and I'll answer whatever question you have for me, and you get a shout out at the end of each episode. If you want to learn how to become a member of the Knowlton's Rangers, go to patreon.com/unplugged. That's patreon.com/unplugged. All right, well, that is all for my spiel. Thanks for listening to the History Unplugged podcast, from ancient Greece to the Cold War and everything else in between. See you next time.